Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Trouble at the End, and tonight we wrap up our pass-through study here in the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at the last prophecy of Daniel at the end of time. And so we've been going through the study here of Daniel since the beginning of the month, and we're going to wrap it up tonight. And so Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Even at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book." So it picks up here where we ended off last, looking at the time of ascendancy of the Antichrist during the final tribulation period. And during that time, we see the Archangel Michael ministers with a special attention protecting Israel during that Gentile time, as seen in Isaiah 26 verse 20-21 and Jeremiah 30 verse 7. And your people means Daniel's Israelite people who can have hope even in the distress of an unprecedented kind set for the tribulation. And the book is the book of the saved, as seen in Malachi chapter 3 verse 16 through chapter 4 verse 3, and also in the book of Revelation, the book of life. And God's people won't be left alone in their hour of greatest need. The deliverance isn't necessary from martyrdom, but from the power of Satan, understood as his attempts to destroy people's faith during the time of distress. And so this promise of deliverance isn't for every last person of Jewish heritage, but those that are found written in the book. And note that not all with Jewish heritage will be saved, but a remnant. In verse 2, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." So two groups will arise from death, constituting the many meaning all, as in John 5:39. "And those of faith will rise to eternal life, and the rest of the unsaved to eternal torment. And the souls of Old Testament saints are already with the Lord at that time, and they shall receive glorified bodies." And this is what makes perseverance through the times of great persecution worthwhile, even if it costs the faithful a painful martyrdom. And this verse denies the heresy of annihilation, which is a teaching among some Christians that eternal torment doesn't mean that someone goes to hell forever. Eventually, they're going to pretty much disappear in hell after some torment. In verse 3, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So those having true knowledge by faith in God's word, not only leaders as in Daniel 11:33, but others as in Daniel 11:35 and Daniel chapter 12 verse 10 here. And to shine in glory is a privilege of all the saved. And any who influence others for righteousness shine like stars in varying capacities of light as their reward. And the faithfulness of believers' witness will determine one's eternal capacity to reflect God's glory. And some see turn many to righteousness reflecting Revelation 7 of the 144,000 evangelists from Israel's tribes during the tribulation. In verse 4, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book to the end of time. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." So time of the end refers to the 70th week of tribulation, as we discussed back in yesterday's chapter. And run to and fro speaks of searching for something. And in the tribulation, people will search for answers to the devastation and discover increased knowledge through Daniel's preserved book. And seal the book, it preserves it unaltered until it awaits fulfillment. And the wise know where to find this wisdom, while the foolish run to and fro, seeking answers in vain, as in Amos chapter 8, verse 12, and Daniel 11:36 through chapter 12, verse 3, cover a worldly ruler opposed to God, and also a world religion based on the abomination of desolation and world war, which defeats the ruler, and the time of great tribulation for Israel lasting 3.5 years, and deliverance for the people of God after the tribulation, resurrection and judgment, reward for the righteous, and so on. And verse 5 and 6, it says, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, How long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be?" So two others is speaking of two angels, and Daniel is back at the riverbank that we first saw back in chapter 10, verse 4. And the visions from here through the rest of Daniel took place as Daniel stood at the riverbank. In verse 7, this answers, verse 7, let's read, it says, "Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be times and a half a time. And when the power of the holy people have completely shattered, all these things shall be finished." So this answers the question of verse 6. Adding 1 and 2.5 comes to 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, and back in Daniel 9:27. In the time of trouble, when the little horn, or the willful king, persecutes the saints, in Daniel 7:25 and Daniel 11:36 through 39. And it's the same span that's described in other places, such as Revelation 11, verse 2 and 3, and Revelation chapter 13, verse 5. And I just want to make a quick point that if you want a study through focusing on Revelation, check out my friend Brian Peckham's studies on Saturdays at 12 noon. Sometimes he has to change it up, but he's actually been on a ball lately. So it's on Facebook Live. And the people of Israel will seem completely crushed as things end. But at that time, the Messiah, upon whom they will trust before he returns, will return to rescue them. In verse 8, "Although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, My Lord, what shall be the end of these things?" So, verse 8, the period of persecution is limited in the scope by God. And the progress of God's work always proceeds through weakness, not strength. And you probably feel like Daniel as we go through the prophecies of the Bible. I know I feel that way sometimes. So have you ever felt that prophecy is hard to understand? Well, be comforted and know that Daniel didn't either. Daniel wasn't a doctorate student of prophecy. And that's even though he heard it firsthand. And I wonder if Daniel was anxious as he understood how terrible the time of trouble would be. In verse 9 and 10, "And he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." So the angel told Daniel to make a mental departure from the questioning. The salvation will come to many Jews during the Great Tribulation. And the prophet Zechariah, which we're going to be looking at later this summer, chapter 13, verse 8 and 9, speaks of 1/3. And the truly saved develop in godliness through trials, and the unsaved pursue false values. Verse 11, "And from that time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days." So the daily sacrifice speaks of the end of daily temple sacrifice, previously allowed under the covenant which the Antichrist formed with Israel, which he later causes to seize in the middle of the final 7 years. then favorable relation gives way to persecution. And even his abomination that desecrates the temple back in Daniel 9:27 is accompanied with persecution. And from the intrusion of the abomination there follow the 1,290 days, including the 1,260, which make up the last 3.5 years of the final 7 years. Then 30 days more, possibly to allow for the judgment of the living subsequent to Christ's return before the millennial kingdom blessings begin. In verse 12, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. So this is in the kingdom that gives blessedness after the subjugation to Gentile empires, as seen in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8. And 45 more days beyond the 1,290 days allows for transition between Israel's time of being shattered and God setting up his kingdom. And the chapter ends with verse 13. But you go your way to the end, for you shall rest, and you shall arise in your inheritance at the end of the days. So Daniel's own career would soon involve death, a rise and resurrection. And the kingdom will ensue after the prophesied days of Daniel 9:24 through 27 in verses 11 and 12. And so to wrap up today's study in the book of Daniel, we finished the book of Daniel looking at a future time of trouble for Israel. And we see this Archangel Michael, and we see his role through the Bible. And I want to go over the book of Jude, and that's a one chapter book right before Revelation. And we'll look at verse 9 real quick. It says, yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed the body of Moses, dared not to bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke you. So we see Michael is associated with spiritual battle as the archangel. And let's go into Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. And it says here, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. And I'm going to actually read through verse 8. It says, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So Jesus also, in the Olivet Discourse, quoted verse 1. Let's go over to the Gospel according to Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verse 21. It says here, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. So also, Revelation chapter 12, verse 12. We'll go back into Revelation 12. Revelation chapter 12, verse 12 through 17. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and a times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So verse 14 sounds a lot like what Daniel said. So the serpent spewed out water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, to keep the commandments of God and to have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So the Jewish people will be targets of the fury of the devil directed at them. And Daniel spoke of the book. Let's check out Revelation chapter 13, verse 8 in the next chapter. says, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So we see that the book of life, not all names are recorded in it, and they were recorded before the foundation of the world when God chose his people. And the book of life is mentioned in John's revelation. We also see a promise of deliverance in the chapter's opening. And in verse 2, it showed us the resurrection of the dead. And I want to go over to the gospel according to John, chapter 5. And we're going to look at verse 28, 29. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So, verse 2 gave a clear prediction of the bodily resurrection of the godly and the ungodly for the final judgment, as also seen in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4 through 6, which you can check out on your own. And then Revelation 20:10 describes eternal punishment for Satan and the Antichrist. And verse 3 shows a promise for the righteous. And verse 4 shows instructions to seal the book. And verse 5 through 7, Daniel asked, how long will the time of trouble be? And let's go over to Revelation chapter 11. Verse 2 and 3. It says, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it had been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And so here's John's revelation of the 3.5 year period spoken of. And Daniel, in verse 8 of chapter 12, his last question was, how will it all turn out? And then in verse 9 through 13, we see that the answer that God will purify and preserve his people and set a limit number of days to the time of the trouble. And this wraps up our study that we kicked off back on May 2nd in the book of Daniel. And I just want to thank you for joining me, and I hope that you join us for our summer focus in the book of the minor prophets as we kick off with the book of Hosea next on Friday. So God bless, and we'll see you on Friday.